Washington once again became the epicenter of a political earthquake that no one could have predicted. The lights inside the White House remained on late into the night, and within its corridors, tension hung in the air like a heavy fog. It was there, behind closed doors, that a sudden and controversial decision reverberated across the entire nation. Donald Trump had fired Monarez, one of the key figures in his administration. Within hours, as if triggered by an uncontrollable domino effect, a wave of resignation swept through the CDC, leaving major specialists walking out in what appeared to be a mass exodus. The consequences were immediate and devastating. The atmosphere in the American Capitol resembled the pages of a dark political thriller more than the workings of a long-standing democracy. Conflicting reports poured into the media every minute, turning information into a weapon and eroding public trust. On one side, Trump's staunch supporters applauded the move, framing it as a bold show of strength and leadership. On the other, his critics warned of an unprecedented institutional collapse, a fracture that could leave lasting scars on an already divided nation. And in between those extremes were millions of citizens, confused and stunned, struggling to understand whether they were witnessing a temporary storm or the beginning of an irreversible rupture. Inside the White House, the atmosphere was described as chaotic by those present. Senior advisers, aides, even longtime veterans hardened by years of political maneuvering, admitted to being shocked. For many, Monarez had symbolized competence, strategy, and a much-needed balance in an administration marred by constant turbulence. His removal, abrupt, unprepared, unexplained, was more than a dismissal. It was a signal, one that triggered a furious cascade of speculation and anxiety. This did not happen by chance. Reports indicate that the relationship between Trump and Monarez had been deteriorating for months. Public disagreements over CDC policies and the handling of national directives painted a picture of growing distance. Yet few could have imagined the split would be not only final, but executed with such abrupt force, leaving the country's primary health institution gutted almost overnight. The streets of Washington reflected the tension. Newspapers ran alarmist headlines, television anchors delivered updates in urgent tones, and conversations in cafes around Capitol Hill revolved almost exclusively around this sudden rift. It was impossible to walk into a public space without hearing Monarez's name whispered, debated, or speculated upon. The overriding sentiment was one of uncertainty, and in politics, uncertainty is the perfect fuel for chaos. The international community did not remain silent. Foreign embassies rushed to request detailed reports from their representatives in Washington, alarmed by the implications. Emergency meetings were held in capitals around the world, fearful that political instability in the United States could rattle global markets or derail ongoing negotiations. Meanwhile, back inside the CDC, leading figures packed boxes and cleared offices, some hastily, some with visible frustration. Years of service and credibility walked out of that institution in a matter of hours, leaving gaping holes in its ability to function. Behind closed doors, even more disturbing stories emerged. Staff members described unbearable pressure, meetings that dissolved into shouting matches, and phone calls interrupted by contradictory orders. Some accounts described Monarez's final meeting, where he rose from his chair with heavy words quickly drowned out by an uncomfortable silence. No one dared to respond, no one dared to intervene. To many, it felt like witnessing a crash in slow motion that no one was capable of stopping. Perhaps most startling was the speed with which the resignations cascaded after Monarez's dismissal. Experts of national and international importance, with decades of service and towering reputations, walked away almost in unison. This mass departure stripped the administration not just of technical expertise, but of credibility itself. And in their silence, there was also a message, a refusal to be pawns in a political war that was spiraling further out of control. Science was retreating from the stage, leaving the space open for pure politics, for narrative battles, for raw power plays. This, however, is just the beginning. Over the next chapters, we will dive deeper into the behind-the-scenes drama, the underlying tensions that tore apart the Trump-Monarez partnership, the whispered details of those resignation letters, and the consequences felt both on the international stage and inside the homes of everyday Americans. Prepare to uncover one of the most controversial and unpredictable chapters in recent U.S. history, where every word, every decision, every gesture carried the power to unravel the very structures that once seemed untouchable. Long before the explosive dismissal of Monarez, the signs of mounting tension were already visible, though often ignored by those closest to power. Inside Washington, rumors circulated about heated debates between the White House and the CDC over the handling of national health directives. What began as subtle disagreements quickly evolved into open clashes, where scientific evidence collided head-on with political strategy. It was in this collision that pressure started to build, slowly but relentlessly, almost like a fault line before an inevitable earthquake. Monarez, a figure both respected and feared, was at the center of the storm. Known for his uncompromising insistence on evidence-based decisions, he found himself in direct conflict with a president increasingly determined to shape the narrative in his own terms. Reports from staffers describe meetings where charts and data were thrown onto the table, while Trump countered with polls, news coverage, and campaign optics. Each side spoke a different language, science on one side, politics on the other, and each meeting seemed to push them further apart. Behind closed doors, Monarez became the voice of caution, constantly urging moderation, discipline, and long-term planning. Yet for Trump, who thrived on immediate impact and the theater of quick resolutions, such warnings were more shackles than guidance. "We cannot afford hesitation," one aide reportedly quoted him as saying during a stormy session. For months these exchanges defined the administration, a daily tug-of-war between expertise and authority, patience and impulse, structure and chaos. The strain did not go unnoticed. Within the corridors of the CDC, whispers spread about political appointees interfering in technical reports. Deadlines were shifted without explanation, portions of research were allegedly suppressed, and language in official guidelines was rewritten to soften harsh conclusions. The scientific community grew restless, sensing that their voices were being overshadowed by political expediency. Every suppressed recommendation added to an invisible weight pressing down on those still committed to their mission. As tensions escalated, cracks began to appear in public view. Journalists pressed for explanations when inconsistencies emerged between CDC bulletins and White House statements. Specialists felt cornered, forced to defend studies whose conclusions contradicted the administration's optimism. The public, confused by the contradictions, began to lose confidence, not only in the government but also in the scientists themselves. For Monarez, this was intolerable. His reputation, built on years of rigor, was being eroded under the glare of political stagecraft. Those who worked closely with him describe a man increasingly strained, visibly carrying the burden of responsibility. Meetings at the CDC became long, tense sessions where Monarez urged his team to hold the line, even as reforms from above undermined their work. The climate inside the institution shifted. Morale fell, resignations began to be murmured long before the collective exodus, and a sense of futility crept into the hearts of once optimistic researchers. The pressure extended beyond Washington. Governors, particularly in states hardest hit by the crises the CDC was addressing, expressed frustration at what they viewed as mixed signals. Allies abroad quietly voiced concern as well, questioning whether the United States still offered reliable leadership on public health matters. In diplomatic circles, trust is fragile, and the erosion of credibility at the CDC reverberated with both allies and rivals alike. Meanwhile, Trump doubled down. His public appearances grew more combative, his rhetoric sharper. He painted critics as obstructionists, branding dissent as weakness, and elevated loyalty above technical wisdom. This sharpened the divide. Aides felt trapped choosing between allegiance to the science advocated by Monarez and allegiance to the president's vision. That choice began to fracture entire teams. By the end of that period, the atmosphere had become unbearable. Small disputes transformed into explosive confrontations. Aides later described these clashes as verbal firefights, unrelenting in their intensity. Moments of civility evaporated, leaving behind corridors lined with distrust, fear, and whispered conversations about when, not if, things would collapse. This was the context in which Monarez stood, a man caught between duty to his profession and loyalty to the administration he served. Each passing week tightened the vice, each public contradiction widened the rift. Pressure had become the defining reality in Washington, and though no one could say how it would end, everyone knew the clock was ticking. By the time Trump finally acted, firing Monarez in dramatic fashion, that decision no longer felt sudden to those on the inside. It was the final snap of a cord that had been stretched to breaking point for months. And once it broke, the exodus that followed could not be stopped. The fall of Monarez was not a single event, but rather the culmination of months, perhaps even years, of mounting tension. Yet when the moment arrived, it struck with the speed and violence of a guillotine. His dismissal, signed and executed with brutal precision, resembled less a managerial adjustment and more a symbolic execution, a demonstration of raw power from a president determined to show that no figure, however respected, stood above his authority. The announcement came in the early hours of a restless day in Washington. A terse statement from the White House confirmed what many had feared but few truly expected. Monarez was out. There were no formal speeches of gratitude, no acknowledgment of his years of service, only a cold declaration delivered in the detached tone of political ritual. For his supporters inside the CDC, the news landed with devastating force. Phones buzzed in disbelief, emails circulated frantically, and entire teams stood frozen in hallways, stunned by the absence of the man who had anchored their mission. For Trump, the decision was an assertion of dominance. Behind closed doors, advisers reported that the president viewed Monarez as increasingly disloyal, a figure whose frequent objections undermined not just policy but optics. In Trump's world, loyalty was never optional. It was the price of proximity. And Monarez, in his resistance, had crossed the invisible line between valued advisor and expendable opponent. The final confrontation reportedly came during a volatile meeting inside the Oval Office. Sources describe Monarez presenting a series of grim projections, stark data that contradicted the optimistic narrative being championed by the administration. As he laid out the numbers, figures that warned of worsening crises and uncontrollable risks, the room grew tense. Trump, visibly irate, dismissed the forecasts as exaggerations. Voices rose. At one point, Monarez allegedly slammed his folder shut and declared that ignoring reality would lead to ruin. For Trump, it was the final insult. Within hours, the paperwork was drawn, and Monarez's fate was sealed. The public was not given those details, but whispers circulated through Washington's tight-knit circles. Accounts varied, sometimes contradictory, but the underlying narrative was clear. Monarez had clashed once too often with a president who brooked no defiance. What surprised even seasoned observers was not the decision itself, but its swiftness, the speed with which the White House erased a man once deemed indispensable. The fallout was immediate. Inside the CDC, despair gave way to anger. Colleagues who had respected Monarez's uncompromising integrity now found themselves leaderless, their morale shattered. Many interpreted his removal not as a personnel decision but as a message. Dissent, however principled, would no longer be tolerated. That message resonated far beyond the CDC's walls, chilling scientists and experts across the government who understood the warning all too well. In the media, Monarez's dismissal became headline news. Some outlets framed him as a martyr of science, a man sacrificed on the altar of politics. Others portrayed him as obstinate, too rigid to adapt to the demands of political leadership. The truth lay somewhere in between, obscured by polarized narratives but undeniable in its human dimension. A professional, deeply committed to his calling, struck down at the height of a national crisis. International reactions only inflamed the situation. Allies expressed alarm, fearing that the removal of a respected scientific leader would weaken America's capacity to respond effectively to global challenges. Rival nations seized the opportunity to question U.S. credibility, framing the decision as proof of instability. For Washington, the diplomatic cost of Monarez's fall was immediate and severe. Those closest to Monarez describe his final hours at the CDC as somber yet dignified. He walked through the building quietly, offering brief words of encouragement to colleagues, shaking hands, and leaving behind the impression of a man resigned to his fate but unwilling to surrender his principles. "Stand firm," he reportedly told one group of young researchers. "The truth will always matter." But his departure did not mark an end, it marked a beginning. Almost as soon as he was gone, letters of resignation began flooding the desks of department heads. Experts who had long battled frustrations within the administration now saw no reason to stay. If Monarez, with all his status and influence, could be so unceremoniously discarded, what protection remained for anyone else? And so, his fall became the catalyst for something far greater, a mass exodus that would cripple the institution he had once fought to protect. The firing of Monarez was not simply about one man's downfall. It became the spark that ignited the unraveling of an entire system. If the country saw chaos on the surface, what happened behind closed doors was even more disturbing. The dismissal of Monarez and the wave of resignations had not emerged in a vacuum. They were the product of weeks of backroom battles, whispered threats, and a growing culture of fear that had taken root inside Washington's power structures. Once hidden in the shadows, those stories now began to leak, offering Americans a rare glimpse into the dysfunction of their leaders. Inside the White House, the atmosphere had grown volatile in the weeks leading up to the crisis. Meetings frequently dissolved into shouting matches. Senior officials, once loyal to their roles, began accusing one another of betrayal. To the outside world, policy discussions sounded calm and orderly. In reality, they often resembled arenas, where voices clashed over loyalty to Trump versus fidelity to science and truth. Witnesses recall moments that bordered on the surreal. In one closed-door session, Monarez reportedly attempted to walk senior staffers through hard data, showing a clear trajectory that contradicted the administration's messaging. The numbers, stark and undeniable, appeared on screens projected across the room. Yet instead of listening, officials attacked Monarez for disloyalty, questioning whether his warnings were politically motivated. The science, in that moment, was buried beneath a trial of loyalty. The CDC itself faced its own storm. In private, analysts spoke about reports being altered before publication. One researcher described spending nights preparing carefully worded statements, only to have sentences rewritten by political aides to soften conclusions. In team meetings, fear of reprisal silenced objections. "We began to whisper in hallways rather than speak openly," one former employee admitted. The culture of collaboration was collapsing, replaced by paranoia. At the heart of the tension was Trump's demand for unity, not the unity grounded in shared facts, but in public alignment with his vision. Loyalty became the currency of survival. Officials who voiced hesitation found themselves sidelined, excluded from key meetings, or publicly humiliated. Those willing to echo the president's words, however contrary to the evidence, were rewarded with greater influence. The toll on individuals was severe. Staff began to avoid one another, unsure who they could trust. Some described an environment where even casual conversations could be reported back to superiors, where every word was calculated, every sentence weighed for political safety. Offices once filled with scientific debate became quiet, heavy with suspicion. Like a house of cards, the very core of institutional trust was falling apart. When Monarez finally reached his breaking point, it was not simply over principle. It was survival. The relentless attacks, the discrediting of his work, the whispered accusations of betrayal, all combined until staying in position meant sacrificing his integrity. His final confrontation with Trump was less an isolated event and more the climax of weeks of suffocating pressure. After his fall, the divide sharpened. Supporters of Trump doubled down, framing the removal as proof that the administration would not tolerate obstruction. Yet inside the CDC and among the ranks of departing scientists, the story was told in hushed tones. That truth had been suffocated, that expertise had been sacrificed to loyalty. The closed doors of Washington had concealed intense struggles, but once Monarez was gone, those doors could no longer contain the fallout. What remained was a city consumed by mistrust, an administration obsessed with control, and a nation left to wonder if the pursuit of loyalty had permanently eclipsed the pursuit of truth. While Washington was consumed by power struggles and intrigue, ordinary Americans were left to face the consequences of the turmoil. Behind the noise of resignations and political rhetoric lay a society wrestling with growing uncertainty, fear, and confusion. For many citizens, the question was simple yet terrifying. If the experts had walked away, who could they trust now? The first signs of the impact appeared in communities across the nation. Conflicting messages spilled into daily life. Guidance that once came with the authority of science now shifted depending on political speeches or media outlets. Parents wondered whether they could still rely on the CDC's recommendations for their children. Business owners, already struggling, doubted the validity of protocols that seemed to change week by week. Confidence, once the lifeline of public compliance, began to erode. The absence of trusted experts created a vacuum quickly filled by speculation. Social media became the battleground. Rumors, misinformation, and conspiracy theories spread faster than official corrections. Some citizens rallied behind partisan narratives, while others simply disengaged, exhausted by the constant contradictions. What emerged was not clarity, but polarization, a society fractured along the same lines that divided its leaders. Healthcare workers felt the crisis most acutely. Without clear directives from the CDC, hospitals and clinics were forced to improvise, relying on fragmented data and local decisions. Frontline professionals expressed frustration, describing how the lack of stable guidance left them vulnerable not only to the crisis itself but also to public backlash. Each shift in messaging fueled anger among patients, who accused medical staff of incompetence or dishonesty. The uncertainty also seeped into the economy. Consumer confidence dipped as investors watched instability spread from Washington into everyday life. International partners expressed concern, some pulling away from negotiations, others recalibrating their expectations of American leadership. The ripple effects touched trade, markets, and diplomatic relations, leaving ordinary workers to bear the burden of political chaos far beyond their control. Perhaps most painful was the toll on trust. Polls showed a dramatic decline in confidence, not just in political leaders, but in institutions once considered untouchable. Citizens who had looked to the CDC for decades as a beacon of science and reliability now questioned its integrity. For the older generation, it was a disorienting moment. An agency that had guided them through crises of the past now seemed paralyzed. For younger citizens, it reinforced the idea that truth itself was fragile, subject to political battles rather than objective evidence. Families felt the strain around their own dinner tables. Conversations devolved into arguments as differing sources of information divided relatives. Communities fractured, no longer united by shared understanding of facts, but by their chosen allegiances. In small towns and big cities alike, the domino effect was visible in human terms. Fractured trust, simmering anger, and a deep sense of abandonment. Globally, the impact was just as stark. Allies who once turned to American science for leadership now looked elsewhere, establishing networks of collaboration that bypassed Washington entirely. The reputation of U.S. expertise, earned over generations, was suddenly in doubt. Questions that had once been unthinkable, can America still lead, can it still be trusted, were now voiced openly in international conferences. For Americans on the ground, all of this translated into one overwhelming reality: confusion. At the grocery store, at the doctor's office, at town hall meetings, the crisis of leadership was no longer an abstract headline, it was a lived experience. Every decision felt heavier, every choice clouded by doubt. It was not simply about politics in Washington. It was about the erosion of certainty in the daily lives of millions. The fall of Monarez and the exodus of experts were not just stories of power. They were stories of people, of families, of societies struggling to make sense of a world suddenly stripped of clarity. And in that void, America found itself standing at the edge of something darker. chaos not just within government, but within the very fabric of its people's trust.